Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Refugee Welcome Collective Lunch and Learn series. In these sessions, we aim to bring you interesting and timely information. Whether you're a volunteer, community sponsor, resettlement agency staff person, a local advocate, or just someone who's interested in learning more, we hope that you enjoy today's session on approaching challenging conversations. Refugee Welcome Collective collaborates with partners to provide in-depth training programs, weekly learning sessions, resources, and on-demand technical assistance for sponsors, resettlement agency staff, refugees paired with sponsors, community and institutional partners, and others to support quality community sponsorship programs across the United States. Just for a housekeeping note, as a reminder to everyone who is joining us today, everyone on today's webinar is automatically muted. However, if you have any tech issues, please submit a question in the chat or questions in the box so that we can assist you. There will be time at the end of the webinar today for Q&A. This brings us to our presenter. Our presenter is Abby Simpson, Program Officer of Community Engagement at Church World Service. I'll turn it over to Abby.
Thanks, Jessica. Yes, my name is Abby, and we're going to chat today just about what it looks like to handle challenging conversations and challenging situations, mostly when dealing in a co-sponsorship or volunteer space, but recognizing that when working between community members and staff and newcomers, it's a very fluid space. There's a lot of potential things that can just happen. We talk a lot about how in this work you have to be willing to pivot and be nimble, and that is very true. And the thing is that when you have to be willing to pivot and be nimble, sometimes things are challenging and you have to have hard conversations about it. So that is what we're going to chat about today. Alrighty, so, all right, hope everyone can see my screen. Just so you all know, like Jessica said, I am from Church World Service, and Church World Service is a faith-based organization transforming communities around the globe through just and sustainable responses to hunger, poverty, displacement, and disaster. We are one of the 10 national resettlement agencies, if you are not familiar with us. Our vision is a world where all have food, voice, and a safe place to call home. So just gonna kick us off by chatting a little bit about what goes into a difficult conversation. And recognizing that in every single situation that you as a community member or a staff member or just someone who is in some way, shape, or form involved with the process of welcoming, that your work is very important and very needed, but it can be challenging because of things like different perceptions, assumptions about intent, feelings, and blame. We work in a very fragile space with welcoming newcomers who have often been through really traumatic events, and oftentimes they are working to integrate into a society that is challenging to integrate into, and the people who are working to help them, from staff to community members, might have a different perception of how all that should occur. Emotions are really easy to get tangled up in everything. You form attachments to families that arrive. You want the best for them. Of course you do. Absolutely. But just recognizing that oftentimes emotions can drive conversations or challenges. So there can be a lot of root causes for why a difficult conversation needs to occur. So I'm not going to read through this whole slide, but just want to highlight that there's a lot of really great conflict resolution tools out there. And at the end, or I'm not sure if it will get sent out after, but you can drop some of those tools either in the chat or out via email afterwards. But just recognizing that in conflict resolution, the first step is just recognizing that conflict is existing. It can be easy to try to avoid a challenging conversation, but recognize that conflict oftentimes can be healthy, and if it needs to occur, then The first step is recognizing that. Yeah, not going to read through all of these, but just want to highlight just a few. First being communication, recognizing that no matter what your role is in the process of welcoming, that the most important thing is to make sure that we are all caring for the newcomer that you're working to support, and increasing healthy communication between all relevant parties is incredibly important. And then also just want to highlight about following an action plan, which we'll talk about in a little bit, making sure that everyone understands their role, and is informed about how they are going to best support the person that they're working to serve. So if conflict arises, which it does, some questions just to ask yourself before entering into a challenging conversational space. Focusing on what your goal is, doing some self-reflecting about what biases or assumptions you might have, some perceptions, emotions, working to find some common ground. It's often easy to start when you find common ground and then build off of that. And focusing on developing empathy, respect, valuing other people's points of views, focusing on having a constructive, not deconstructive dialogue versus a debate, and what boundaries need to be set in place in order to have a respectful conversation, not just for you, but for the newcomers. So recognizing that when having a challenging conversation, whether this conversation be with a staff member at a local resettlement agency that you are volunteering with, whether this be within members of your own co-sponsor group that might see things in different ways, whether this is with the newcomer that you're working with directly, it is important to approach it in a positive and respectful way, recognizing that everyone, regardless of their status or their experience, deserves respect, and wanting to honor that. But recognizing also that it is important to keep everyone safe. It's important to maintain safety of staff and of newcomers and clients. We highly, highly, highly recommend that all conversation be handled in the appropriate way, in the appropriate space. And so here are some de-escalation tips, just things to remember when engaging in a hard conversation. Focusing on remaining calm, being empathetic, being clear, working to find common solutions, being collaborative, being reflective, and also just being honest, not making promises you can't keep, recognizing that we work in a very fluid space and it's very hard to make a promise and truly follow through on that, just because there are so many situations that happen outside of your control. So I want to go through a couple of example scenarios, and feel free to write some of your answers in the chat. I'm not sure if people can come off me. It might just be easiest to do the chat. And I am sharing screen, so Jessica, or if anyone else is on that could read people's answers, that would be absolutely fantastic. So reading through this first example scenario, so Mary, who is a volunteer, is over-involved in an ESL class. Oh no. Every time Mahmoud, a client, mispronounces or misuses a word, Mary quickly interrupts and speaks over him to correct him. Mahmoud confides in Casey, the volunteer teacher, that when he sees Mary volunteering in his ESL class, it makes him anxious and he does not want to speak up. Casey is unsure of how to handle this situation with Mary. So here we're dealing with a challenging environment, maybe one that you've experienced yourself, where you have two volunteers, but one is a teacher, so she probably maybe has gone through some additional training, is seen in a little bit of a higher position of leadership, both by the clients and maybe by other volunteers and by the staff members. And Casey is leading a class, and she also is working with Mary, who is a volunteer who's just crossing some boundaries. Since this has been brought to Casey's attention by a client, it's really, really important that this is addressed and handled, recognizing that maybe Mary is making other clients feel uncomfortable as well, and maybe they haven't spoken up. So feel free to pop in the chat how you would handle this either as Casey, maybe as a staff member involved. There's so many different perspectives in this space. So how would you handle this situation?
Abby, one question someone put in the Q&A box for clarification was, what is Mary doing in the ESL class? Is she a student also?
That's a fantastic question. So she's a volunteer, so we can assume that similar to like a teacher's aide or just someone who's around to check work, provide support, maybe work on dialogue, but she's not being the main person leading the class. She's just there as a volunteer. Many of our ESL programs at different offices will have volunteers that will come and they'll work one-on-one with clients, maybe filling out worksheets, doing conversations, but then there'll still be a main leader person, someone who maybe has a little bit more of a background in education and can put together curricula. Hope that helps.
Okay, first response that is in the chat. If Mary is a volunteer, then she should have a service description that provides clear guidelines on expectations of her volunteer work. Whoever supervises her needs to review that service description with Mary. Hold on, cut off to better support clients.
Wow, that is an absolutely fantastic answer, and that is 100% correct. Our volunteers across different resettlement agencies and affiliate organizations should have some type of either job description or commitment form. They should have had to go through some type of training. And so therefore, and the reason why they go through that is not just so that they get to be educated themselves, but so that way that they can be held accountable. So like you said, if Casey is the person who is supervising Mary, then Casey should sit down with Mary and have that conversation about where she has crossed some boundaries and maybe parts of her job description. If it's a staff member or someone else who is supervising Mary, then that person should be the one that has the conversation. That's an absolutely fantastic, fantastic point in response.
Another person via the Q&A box responded for a suggestion of what Casey could say. So
Perfect.
Casey could say, quote, Mary, it's really important that we not correct clients all the time. They need to start to feel comfortable speaking a new language, even with mistakes. Thanks for your understanding.
That is perfect. Yes. And that highlights a couple of things that we talked about previously, where it speaks with empathy. It thanks Mary for what she's doing, but it also explains the area of challenge, and it explains that in a way where the client's perspective and feelings are acknowledged and supported. So that's an absolutely fantastic response.
And one more that is in
Yeah.
the Q&A box was a suggestion to compliment Mahmoud for bringing up this concern.
That is awesome. Yes, absolutely. It is so important that we, anyone who is working in any type of position of authority over a newcomer, whether that be in a volunteer position, staff, just someone in the community who's providing services, that they acknowledge and support and elevate newcomer voices. And so thanking Mahmoud and also supporting him and acknowledging the fact that it can be very challenging and bold to stand up or acknowledge that someone who is in some type of position of authority over you, even informally in a volunteer sense, when they are not serving you the way that you want to be treated, it can be very challenging to speak up. So Mahmoud should be very congratulated for that, and that should be acknowledged. So thank you for bringing up that really, really valid point.
There's one more in the chat. Do you want me to do this one more and
Yeah,
then we'll go
yeah,
to the
yeah, keep
next? I
going.
think you have another
Yeah.
scenario, right?
Yeah, keep going.
Okay, so another person in the chat said, Casey should confirm with Mary their common goals and acknowledge Mary's interest in Mahmoud's development. Casey should then proceed to reinforce their roles in the classroom and direct Casey to yield to Mary when correcting Mahmoud.
That's awesome. Yeah, and truly so often situations like this come up, and if they're not addressed, it can really spiral, right? But often if they're addressed early on, it can be a very simple course correction. Maybe it is something as simple as there was a misunderstanding of how Mary was supposed to interact with the students in the class. And Casey just having that brief conversation might just fix it up really quick. So great point. Acknowledging of everyone's clear roles and responsibilities is a great place to start, a really good firm foundation of where things can be built off of, and just puts everyone in their place, acknowledges how everyone is supposed to interact, recognizing that different roles exist for different reasons. Maybe, we obviously don't know all the background here, but maybe Casey has a lot of extensive training and experience in teaching in ESL classes. That's why she's put in this position of authority. And so we want to acknowledge her role. We want to acknowledge that Mary's role is also important. And we want to acknowledge how clients interact with that. But we have to recognize that everyone has a space, and their space is important that they stay there. Alrighty. If people continue to have questions or comments about this scenario, feel free to put them in the chat. But we are going to move on to our second example scenario. And thank you all for such really good comments so far. Absolutely fantastic. So, second scenario, Mike, who's a regular volunteer, hears from a newcomer that he is helping that they have not received their SNAP cards. If you're not familiar, SNAP is connected with food stamps. Mike decides to investigate this without consulting the resettlement staff. The staff get upset because he created confusion with the newcomer. He accidentally opened 2 applications, oh no, creating confusion at the SNAP office. How could Mike, the newcomer, and the staff all have handled this situation better? So we're dealing once again with numerous actors, probably some miscommunication, but we're dealing with a volunteer who is working to handle a situation without consulting other people. We're working with a newcomer family who have shared that there is a challenge. They've shared it with Mike, but they're also dealing with resettlement staff whose job it is to handle these things. So feel free to put in the chat how all or any of these people could have handled this situation better.
A comment in the, or yeah, something in the chat. Ask Mike why he didn't reach out to the RA for help. And then like a question underneath of that is there some kind of like distrust that needs to be addressed?
That is absolutely fantastic. Great point, especially about distrust. Yeah, because one correct situation would have been that Mike should have discussed this with the staff, or even better, he should have empowered the newcomer to reach out to their case manager directly. And the fact that neither of those things happen probably means that there is some type of distrust. So figuring out what the root of that is, where it's coming from, and how it can be fixed is a great first step before conflict would get even larger in this space, especially if Mike's a regular volunteer. So great point.
Another in the chat.
Yeah.
Mike should have been trained to run resource/system issues with professional staff.
Absolutely. Yeah, and Mike should have been trained. And maybe volunteers are trained in how to handle SNAP applications. Maybe they're not. It truly depends up to each resettlement agency. But if he wasn't trained and this was a space that he felt like he should be able to do, that's a problem. And if he was trained in how to do this and it wasn't done correctly because you opened two applications, then there needs to be either better training or retraining in this space. So fantastic point.
And some more from the chat.
Yeah.
Mike reacted and not responded correctly. Again, it is about providing clear expectations, and Mike should have known the proper procedure prior to causing the mess. Maybe staff, Mike, and the client can sit down and go through the scenario and clear up for everyone in the room.
Yeah, that's absolutely fantastic, especially talking about sitting down and talking about it. If Mike doesn't have a background in understanding why the SNAP cards have not been delivered, then there can be a lot of confusion around that, maybe a misperception, believing the government systems move quicker than they do. But it also feels like there's probably a little bit of miscommunication or confusion on behalf of the newcomer because they have not received their cards and maybe think that they should have received them. So it sounds like sitting down with all relevant parties and explaining expectations regarding the timeline of things would have saved a lot of confusion in this space.
And then one more question
Yeah.
or comment in the chat. Mike should have been trained to understand the lines of communication that should take with all issues and not pass by the resettlement staff.
Yeah, that's awesome. And most resettlement agencies have some type of feedback mechanism for volunteers to communicate either directly to a community engagement staff or maybe a case manager, because oftentimes volunteers are working closely with newcomers, and maybe a newcomer will share a challenge or a problem with a volunteer, and they don't want to or feel able to share it with a staff member. But the volunteer can then share it with the staff member if appropriate. And so definitely it is important for everyone to remember what those feedback mechanisms are, how to respect privacy in those spaces, but how to best utilize them. So fantastic point. All right. Anything else from the chat?
Nothing else in the chat and nothing else in the Q&A box, but a good time to remind people, we will have time for Q&A. And so if you have questions that you're thinking of now, feel free to put those in the Q&A box so we have them ready to go when that time comes.
Awesome. All right. Well, I do want to just chat about continued learning. There's so many great tools and resources out there on conflict resolution. There's fewer tools out there about conflict resolution in this very niche space of refugee resettlement. CWS has developed a challenging conversations guide that, while geared towards staff, can be used by community members, and then also have a couple of other links that can be shared out. But just want to once again acknowledge that if there is a unique situation that you are dealing with, first of all, you can always put it in the chat and we can chat about it now. But recognizing that while there are some standard ways of how challenging conversations should occur that we've talked about, oftentimes things are very niche. And so it is important to focus in on what you can do in your specific situation. Alrighty, so I do want to have just a couple of discussion questions, and I'm going to read all of them, and then feel free to answer any of them that you would like, either in the chat or off mute. I know that a couple of them have numerous questions in them, so feel free to answer whatever you would like. So reflect on the time when you had to handle a challenging interaction. What challenges did you face, and how did you resolve them? Think about the conflicts that you experienced while working with a community organization. Maybe that's a resettlement agency, maybe it's a different community organization. How did you approach resolving it? What techniques or principles from this discussion could have improved your approach? How would you handle a similar conflict differently in the future? Reflect on how your experiences have contributed to your personal growth and understanding of community dynamics. What lessons have you learned about collaboration, communication, and supporting vulnerable populations? How did these insights inform your future involvement in community initiatives?
And I think, as Abby said, it might be easier to come off mute. So give me one moment to participants. I'm going to pause the recording and then I will allow everyone to have the function to come off mute. You're also still welcome to share via the chat, but just give me one moment.